right, welcome everyone to the Cardea users group meeting for October 14th. Let's go over the second half of our machine readable governance discussion. I will go ahead and share the presentation here. Okay, so last time we left off with how a governance file can contain information that defines who the participants are, what their roles are, what actions are able to be taken, and then the privileges which map those actions to roles, so that anyone who interacts with the system can see who is allowed or expected to do what. And then Simon did a demo for us of how the privileges are actually working. So today we'll pick up where we left off, and we're going to discuss presentation definitions a little bit. So one of the most complicated and powerful and important parts of governance is deciding what proof of information about you or about data constitutes good enough. What are the standards for saying, yes, you meet these particular conditions? And as we've done a couple times, one of our use cases is with health requirements and travel. So for example, have you been tested or have you been vaccinated, or do you have the proper exemptions and quarantines and whatever the standards are, do you have those in place in order to be allowed to travel? And in the COVID example, some countries have multiple ways that you can meet those criteria. You could be tested positive over a month ago, over 28 days ago. So that means that, yes, you had the disease and you've recovered, you're alive and no longer contagious. Or you could test negative in the last 3 days. So that says you don't have the disease in a way that we can detect. You could have one of several different types of vaccines that could meet the criteria. And those are some ideas for things that you would need to test. So in order to handle a variety of requirements and the complexity of those requirements, we went looking through the standards that are available in the SSI verifiable credential community. And the DIF working group has a spec for what's called a presentation definition. And it's a way of doing exchange of presentations and defining how that works. And there's a lot of horsepower involved here that allow us to do some pretty amazing things with figuring out whether a proof meets the requirements. So in our governance file, there are a couple key points where we will link to presentation definitions, and we use a hash link. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with a hash link, that's a way of linking to an object while also saying something about the state that the content of that link was in when we linked to it. So you can take all the contents of the file, run them through a one-way hashing algorithm, a mathematical evaluation of the content that spits out a much shortened version. If you look at that shortened version today, and then you run a hash function on the content later, the hash function will return the same result every time if the content hasn't changed. But if you run the hash function and you end up with a different result than the link includes, then you know that someone tampered with it. So with presentation definitions and governance and workflows, especially where you're trying to establish trust, being able to prove whether something has changed or not is really important. So with the presentation definitions, since those are the de facto standards of admission or approval or granting or things like that, it's really important to be able to prove that they've not been tampered with. If you're traveling to a foreign country and their standards show that you're going to be evaluated on a certain set of criteria, and your agent evaluates the hash and you find that the criteria have changed without being properly accounted for, then you know that someone's gaming the system and is could be trying to capture your data or mess with people. So unfortunately, that's kind of a technical overview, but the idea is that there are various ways, there could be various standards for entering a country that are based on country of origin or on age or other things. And each one has a collection of standards, and we link to each one with a hash link so that you can pick the right one and verify that it's working properly. Presentation definitions are complicated files. They're actually bigger than the governance files because they have to address each and every individual field of the schemas and not just the list of schemas themselves. So here's kind of the starting point of a presentation definition. They're named, so you can say, we've got one for trusted traveler. You can have one that's trusted traveler over 65, or you could have one that says trusted traveler New York, which could be different than Africa or Europe or Asia, depending on standards involved there. You can describe it with a purpose, and you can leave a comment. Each presentation definition has a unique ID, so you can distinguish them one from another. And then you can start off with a list of submission requirements to say, in order to meet the requirements of this definition, this exchange, we're going to require that you pick one of the options in this set of proofs that are valid. All right, before I continue, does anybody have any questions about what a presentation definition is meant to accomplish, or our discussion about hash links, either one?
So the presentation definition would likely tie it specifically to the schema ID, correct?
Yes. So if we go further in the code here, that set of options, they're called input descriptors. So this is one of 3 or 4 input descriptors. And one of the options for meeting this presentation requirement is this input descriptor, which is called, we're going to do it with a lab result. And it belongs to the group of health proof options. And for this one, you need to have this a credential of this particular schema. In this case, a lab result credential of version 1.4, naming them the same thing as a helpful convention. So yeah, this is can be tied directly to a schema. So in this particular presentation definition, we have the schema for lab results. We can also have a proof option that's tied to vaccinations, and another one that's tied to exemptions.
Awesome.
Once you get further down in the input descriptor, so after the schema and the purpose and the name, one of the sections of the input descriptor, or this particular requirement, is called constraints, where you can list the fields that need to be there, and you can look at what kind of data or values need to be in each of those fields. So for example, we need to have an MPID, and that helps us know that this record came from a medical institution, and MPIDs are strings. Or most of them end up being strings. Let's find an interesting one here. Okay, so here's an interesting one. You could apply a filter that says that the minimum value is the date of today minus a certain number. These are the dates are being operated on as or stored as Unix timestamps, so they're numeric representation of seconds, and that allows you to do things like math. So from today we can go back or forward a certain amount of time, and then we can do what's called a predicate proof, which is we can say, does the value in the holder's credential meet this standard? And we can get a Boolean, a true or false answer, that says yes or no without having to reveal the specific value that was in there. So, for example, with the positive test or the negative test, we can find out, did this person meet this criterion? And we don't need to know exactly when they had the disease. Or you can do things like, if you're talking about, like, say, a driver's license situation where you go into a bar or a dance club, they want to know how old you are. You can say, yeah, I'm old enough, without saying that you're 22 or 99. The bar, the bouncer doesn't need to know that. He just needs to know if he's allowed to let you in. And so that's what some of these predicates can accomplish. A little interesting thing here is that for the path of the result of your lab, meaning whether your result was negative or positive for, say, a COVID test, we actually have two options. It could be one of negative with a particular date range that's applicable, or positive with a different date range that's applicable. Let's see. Okay. I think that's it on the structure of a basic presentation definition. Yes, James.
Just to ask a hand grenade question that I think might be worthwhile considering, that I don't know if we've talked much about, but are we able to define in the presentation definition fields that shouldn't be asked for? So for instance, I think it could be valuable to have, you may have a credential that has everything, but the verifier in whatever case may not need all that information. So indicating that that shouldn't be part of the proof request could potentially be pertinent.
So correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, but I think that it's a positive situation, meaning we list the fields that we need. And so you could compare what's being requested against what they're supposed to ask for. So a holder could say, I'm going to download the same presentation definition that the verifier is using. And if the verifier is behaving, then they will ask for these fields. If they ask for something that's not in this list of fields, then we know that they're not behaving. They're asking for stuff that's outside what they're supposed to do. So
yes, that's correct. And James, the answer to the question is that in the perfect scenario, both the holder and the verifier would refer to the same presentation definition to grab those constraint fields, and they must match.
I didn't see anything, James, in the specification that says this field is not allowed. I think it's just basically about saying which ones we're going to ask for.
That makes sense to me. I think it's a your point about being able to highlight that by the fact that it is not present and if they're asking for it, I think works for that. I think we need some form to call that out, that the holder needs to check to make sure that it's actually matching the definition,
Yeah, if we write, any tutorials or documentation to help other people utilize this in the context of governance properly, that's a very important point. It also speaks to the philosophy that we've tried to approach all of this governance with, which is this governance can help align behaviors and expectations, and it's really powerful in doing that. It can be really helpful, but we don't want to block off the ability for people to form relationships outside of this list of participants, or to take their data and go wherever they want to take it and work with other verifiers or other agents in ways that are not prescribed here in these files. And so it's the same kind of thing where perhaps you have a presentation definition and there's an organization that has a very good reason to ask for something that's just outside it, but can't publish their own presentation definition at the moment. And you decide that's okay. And you say, I'm going into this nightclub and it's ladies' night, and so I'm okay disclosing my gender so that I can get into ladies' night, even though that's not the typical situation at the door with the bouncer. You know, there could be a case where that works. And we're not shutting down those behaviors, we're merely enabling good ones.
Yep, and I think one of the cool things there is that you can highlight to the user. You don't necessarily have to say no, you can't do it. You could you can highlight, hey, warning, they're asking for something that we're not expecting here, and you can still continue, but it gives control to the user.
Exactly. SSI is all about consent, and so if there's, you know, if you raise the warning and they want to go forward anyway, you know, it's caveat emptor a little bit, buyer beware. You know, be careful as a sovereign individual with what you do with your data. We'll warn you, we'll put up guidelines and paint lines on the road and whatever, but if necessary, you know, go off road or cross over to the other lane if you want to or you need to, and you know, in those cases. So, okay, let's see here. All right, so a presentation definition can be used for two things. We're using it to generate the proof request, and then because there's more nuance and more power in the presentation definition than a standard proof request, you know, verification can handle, we can also use it for some validation of the data on the back end after the proof presentation. So in an ideal world, our code would be using present proof version 2.1, and all our agents would understand the presentation exchange as defined in the presentation definition. Our current code base is using present proof version 1. That means that depending on the requirements of the presentation definition, we may have to generate many proof requests. So in this case, you know, where we can ask for a positive or a negative lab result, or we can ask for 3 different COVID vaccinations, different types of COVID vaccinations, or an exemption. You could have, you know, 6 proof requests that get generated, and you know that the UI on many folders doesn't deal with that super well. You end up pushing the button that says don't present this, don't present that, please present this, don't present this. And you push the button a lot, or it's a little clumsy, but we're getting there. We'll move beyond the current problems and, you know, our demo use case with our current code base, and we'll get to the point where your agent can understand all of the options and only present to you the ones that would actually work in a more concise or smooth way. Chat here. Yeah, stepping stone, exactly. And that's a big preface to this entire presentation on machine readable governance, is that it's not perfect, it's not done. We're learning as we go, but we have actual implementation and some experience with it working. So we'll learn and share as we grow. Okay, let's see. Presentation validation, definition of validate, whether presentation meets requirements. Okay, so another example here would be, let's say that you are able to pass the validation or the verification. You have, you know, the code goes whiz whiz, buzz buzz, and says yes, your cryptography checks out, and your credential was issued by a valid issuer. But after the fact, after that you've proven that the cryptography worked, you can make additional decisions based on the content or the data in the credential. Let me see if I can think of an example real quick here. Let's see. Okay, so let's say that you pass the verification and your credential contains a location where your vaccine was given to you, where it was administered. And so we know that, let's say Pfizer vaccines are approved in lots of places all over the world, but we find out that there's a particular clinic that was, in the last 6 months was giving placebos, there's saline injections and not COVID vaccines. And so after your credential is verified as valid, then you can run, using the presentation definition, you could run some logic that says, if you're one of these names, then you don't get to pass. You're not going anywhere because your COVID vaccine was bogus. Let's see. So that's a way to do some business type logic based on a presentation definition after the cryptography has been verified. Okay, so Simon has been hard at work writing code, and we demonstrated code that works with privileges, and which means actions that particular roles are allowed to take. He demoed that last time. So today he's going to show us a little bit about generating proof requests from the presentation definition. Simon, whenever you're ready.
If you are talking, Simon, you were on mute.
Yeah, thanks. So my demo will be a little shorter than the last time. But you can see on the holder side of things that I already issued myself vaccination record and vaccine exemption record. And I'm ready to issue myself some credentials here. So I would go, and I'm on the government right now. I'm going to connect. That creates a secure connection. And here is me. So before, if you remember, we had to issue trusted traveler based on the specific proof that the holder had. So whether we had a vaccine credential, we could issue based on the vaccine. If it was an exemption, we could issue based on the exemption. Right now, it's not the case. Right now, when I push this button, it will go and check on the governance file, and it will look into the actions. Let me demonstrate that really quick. Is my governance framework. And so we know that one of the action that we can perform as the government agent is to issue trusted traveler. And we know that we must use the presentation definition, and we have access to the actual file. Again, in the real scenario, this would be hosted on the external server somewhere, and we can just call the API and get the file, access to the file. Just, this would be probably represented as a hash link later on. But the presentation definition, as Mike mentioned, is strictly requiring some health proof options for issuing a specific credential, which is trusted traveler. And we specify that we need to pick one of those options to be able to issue the credential. So what will happen when I click the button, the code will grab the information from the presentation exchange, and it will go through, loop through, and it will create the attributes and predicates based on the input descriptors constraints. And depending on the complexity, it will spit out the number of presentation requests. So in our case, right here, we know that we have 3 input descriptors, one for the vaccine exemption, another one is for vaccination, and the third one is for the lab result. But just note that the lab result has some complex in-field dependencies. So it has 2 different kinds of conditional logic. So it can be negative. The lab result can be negative if the lab specimen date and the lab specimen date is not more than 3 days ago, and it can be positive if the lab specimen date is more than 28 days ago. So this will loop through these conditions, and based on the Cartesian products of set, it will create two presentation definitions. And if we would have another field with 3 more of the conditions, it will create 6 more. So the Cartesian product of sets was a really good way of solving this problem and make it automate the process. So again, you saw that I have 2 credentials. I click the button, and here we're gonna look at some code. So you will see that as of right now, since we do not handle multiple presentations simultaneously, it's gonna fail on those credentials that we cannot present, but it will keep going, and it will check on the verification side of things. And we will pass the predicates test, cryptography, and it will issue us trusted traveler. So there's a little UI flaw that the credential list would not update properly. But if I refresh the page, you can see that we actually issued ourselves 2 trusted traveler based on 2 valid credentials that we had. So as soon as we switch to the present proof 2.1 and can submit 1 presentation request with multiple proof requests in it, so 1 message with multiple proof requests, the holder should be able, the holder app should be able to handle that and let users to pick and choose from those credentials that would satisfy the submission requirement for the trusted traveler, and it will result in issuing just a single trusted traveler. But as for showing the proof of concept, this is the workflow, and that's working. Any questions, concerns?
Excellent demo, Simon. Thank you. All right, so we'll go back to our presentation here. All right, so we've reached the end of the code that we have presently implemented and working, but we have some things that we can show for where we're headed, and have potentially some discussion about things that are in the future. So workflows. We could do some work to provide a scripted series of actions. So to say, besides issuing this particular single credential to, from a lab, you could instruct the holder on what they're supposed to do. So you could say, holder, please connect to this agent and get this credential, and then successfully completing that task, connect to the next agent and present your credential, and then once that's verified, get this other credential. And then finally, you can go and talk to these verifiers. And that can provide a lot of important context to agents on how the ecosystem is working, so that the user can get the most out of it. And so, and smooth things out for the people who are running the system, so that they don't have to hold users' hands quite so much in guiding them through the process. And we're using a standard, well, not a standard, but a proposal called interaction documents. And as the workflows can also, each of the protocols have their own state machine that say, we're doing this particular protocol and we're at the beginning or in the middle or at the end. And the whole overall workflow can say, when you get to the end, that's when you go to this next step. Or when you get to an error message, then you take this other different step. And so we need to give credit to Keith Smith, who presented at the Aries working group about interaction documents. I haven't found anything published in written form by him, so you have to go find the video where he presented during the Aries working group. That's the only documentation I have right now. Okay, so here is some sample code. This is rather immature compared to the other things that we've done. It helps describe what a workflow flow could look like. So, for example, the first step is called connect to health issuer, and that's where the holder takes their initial step, and their action is to connect to the target, which is the health issuer. And assuming that they have their next step would be, if successful, then they would go to the step that's named health verify identity. So the health verify identity step would say, okay, I'm the health issuer and it's my initial step. And the condition here is that I have a connection with the holder, and my action is going to be to verify their identity. And assuming I'm able to successfully verify their identity, then we'll move on to health issue credential. So here's health issue credential, and it says that the health issuer can issue any an OR, which would need one of these options. So they could issue a lab order and then a lab result, or they could issue the vaccine, or they could issue a vaccine exemption. Assuming success, we'll move on to connect to travel issuer. And that says, Mr. Holder, go connect to the travel issuer now that you have your health credential. We're only modeling the happy path to kind of show how a workflow could work. But it would be, you could say, instead of success, you could say error, and inside the error condition, you could say if the error was this error, then go to this action. And if it was this other error, then go to this other action. So we can build out that tree of possibilities later. So you connect to the travel issuer if you're the holder, and your target is to connect to the travel issuer. If this works, then you go to travel verify the holder. So the verifier is going to verify this holder with travel stuff. And so the travel issuer is going to verify the identity. And if it's successful, then we'll go on to issue the travel credential. And it says the travel issuer will issue a trusted traveler from the actions. So there's a theoretical chain of actions where each party, based on the step in the process and their role, could know what they're supposed to do or where to go next, and how to handle errors in this overall workflow of going from I have an app on my phone to I have health credentials and a travel clearance at the end.
What would the actions actually correspond to? Like, how would those be linked, if that makes any sense? So issue trusted traveler, how does that get actually correlated into to actual action that takes place?
Let's see. Oh, I went too far. Shooting governance files, metadata. Here we are, actions. So in the governance file, there's a section of named actions. And so you'll notice that these names correspond to the names that are mentioned in the workflow document or the interaction document. And so interaction document refers to these actions and says, go do this thing. When you do this thing, it'll be this protocol and start with this message, and you'll use this schema, and you need this presentation definition. And we could potentially add other necessary information there as well if we need to make sure that the action can be performed smoothly.
Cool.
Does that answer your question, what those named actions mean?
Yes, I think something interesting to think about would be how does if we're using the interaction document, so we started with this governance framework and then we use the interaction document, does there need to be, let's say we then version the governance document, does that impact how the interaction document would then work, like it works in a different way than initially expected? So the versioning there is the thought, I guess.
Good question. Let's think about that for a second. So if you have a particular workflow with some named actions in it, if you go into your governance file and you add actions or you change actions or you remove actions, then adding them would mean that the governance or the interaction document would be unaware of a new action. Removing them would break it for sure. And changing them might be precisely what you want to do, where you say, we're going to take this action, but in this version of the governance, it means a slightly different thing. Like we've upgraded, we still need you to issue a trusted traveler, but we're going to be using a new schema. So I think that there is impact there. And it would be, in my opinion, the responsibility of the person authoring the governance file to verify that the presentation definitions and the interaction documents that they're utilizing would work, at each version of their governance file.
I know one thing that was discussed, I think, in the Aries working group call around the interaction documents, or at least I had the thought in that call, was having the interaction documents be able to be a ad hoc type of thing. So for instance, being able to initiate a interaction based off an interaction document outside of the scope of a governance framework. So I'm wondering if there could be possibility to put actions or such into the interaction document to support that kind of capability.
I suppose that's probably, I wonder if there's some way we can extend this piece of our interaction document to include that kind of information. The problem that you run into trying to do that way, that's excellent for an ad hoc workflow, but then it's harder to verify that the parties that are in that workflow are acting according to the roles and the permissions and the privileges that we established in the governance file. Having this named action allows the agent in this step of the workflow to go and examine the participants' roles, permissions, and privileges to see, is my travel issuer allowed to verify identity? Or is the agent I'm interacting with that's verifying identity, is that linked through the governance file? Are they a travel issuer? So the linkage there would be a little trickier. So there are pros and cons to both. I do like the idea of having it be support ad hoc. I'm uncertain how to handle the part of identifying good actors.
I wonder if you could, and that makes a lot of sense. I wonder if you could have, like, so for instance, if you define your roles and I guess specifically talking about roles, if you define your roles at the top, you could, of the workflow document, if you have just the workflow document, you use those roles and you can, when beginning it in an ad hoc way, you could identify which role you're using. If you are using it in the context of a governance framework, you just have to correlate the role with the governance framework to give additional context to the workflow interaction document.
Yeah, that might work. we'll have to go play with some code and see what it looks like.
Definitely.
Yeah, because if you have, yeah, we'll have to see what it looks like. Our present, if I go all the way to the end, I need a slide break between these. Whoops. Right now, oh, the numbering broke too. That's great. Editing woes. I wrote this, finished it early in the morning, so let's see here. Okay. Right now, our interaction document is embedded in our governance file. And what would likely happen here is you could name and link to a particular workflow. So you'd have a flows section with a selection of named and linked interaction documents that say, here's the workflow. You know, so if you were, say you were running a bank, here's the workflow for withdrawing money. Here's the workflow for opening an account. Here's the workflow for bill pay. You know, you could, or the DMV, here's how you get your title. Here's how you get your registration. Here's how you get your driver's license. Here's how you do plates. Here's how you verify a VIN. You could have several workflows that are referred to in the interaction document that can be selected from and used by the agents that are involved. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, so we did workflows. One interesting idea we had about the code on an individual agent is that you could write an event bus, meaning based on the step or action taken, you could emit an event or notify the entire application that something just happened. And then you could have code that would listen for the events that just happened. So for example, if you said, hey, you know, I am the code responsible for issuing a trusted traveler. Once that happens, you could tell the whole system, hey, everybody, we just had the trusted traveler was issued. And then you could have other code that would say, aha, I've been listening for that. And so now I can display this notification, or I can change the user interface to open new options. Like now that I'm a trusted traveler, let's open this part of the system that says plan my travel, or purchase. I guess that's a bad example because that would be a requirement. You know, book a hotel. You know, you could open other things after an event were to occur. That's kind of an implementation detail, but I was excited about it because it gives our agents power to do things in parallel in response to how the agent is going through the workflow. All right. Another future feature that we need to work on is composability. So one of the diagrams that's been shared in some of our meetings and so on is a diagram that shows one organization publishing a governance file and a different one saying, gosh, I really like that governance file. I would like to use 90% of it. So I'm going to reference that governance file as the starting point to our governance. And then I'm going to specify and thereby override the sections that I want to change. So we're going to use the exact same governance, but we're going to change the list of participants and the mapping of those participants to roles. And that's all I need to change is the participants. We're going to use the same schemas, same privileges, same actions and workflows. We'll just change who's in it. Or you could say, gosh, that's a really good governance file. I'm going to use a different interaction document because I don't need a particular step in that workflow. And so composability is something really powerful for allowing good governance to be utilized and spread through different jurisdictions and parts of the community. This one's when we get to issues of how governance, machine readable governance can spread or influence the whole community, some people have strong opinions about things like this. So does utilizing governance files in this way, does that ring any alarm bells for people, or are there comments or concerns about having a system that works this way?
One worry I would have is on uh, everybody has their own governance file, if that makes sense. So it's not everybody playing in the same pool, if you will. Even if they have the original one, it's there may be differences enough that it changes depending on who you're who you're working with. Their governance is different enough that it's problematic.
Yeah, one of the ideas here is that the people who publish governance files are supposed to be the ones that have jurisdiction or control over the way that this particular system is supposed to work. And so chances are good that if they have jurisdiction and they're going to exercise their sovereignty, they're going to do it their own way, one way or another. So maybe this is a good idea to have as much commonality as we can instead of a whole bunch of squirrels. You're right, though. It might be a little bit trickier to kind of track down which governance is good and which one is, or is how much difference is too much difference. And I guess what we're going to need to do is maybe testing this one. Say, let's do a Cardea interopathon at some point in the future, where we stand up a Cardea ecosystem for a trial in Aruba, and we'll put one next to it for travelers coming to Idaho and Yellowstone. And we'll change the governance in one, and then in the other, and we'll have it be different or inherited or something like that. Let's test it and see how far we can push it until things start to get really awkward or broken.
That's a pretty decent thought, because that could help inform what should be composable or extendable in the governance framework before it's problematic. Like, you're going to need to be able to change who are valid issuers in different geographical places and verifiers, etc. But changing entire portions of the workflow might be problematic, for instance.
Yeah, the workflow might be a no touchy, or it might be we really need to agree on the verification standards for health and travel, or those are mandated from the government or something. You might really not want to change those, whereas who's in and who's out as a participant could be important to change. So that's a good thought. Related to composability is discoverability. So if I travel here in Idaho and I go to Yellowstone and everything's happy, and then I get on a plane to go to Aruba, how does my app know which governance to use, or that I'm crossing boundaries, or which governance is good? So one of the things is going to be figuring out how do we share our governance or make it available or visible to people, and is there a way to have a directory or a rating system that says which ones to use and which ones to ignore? So the reputation and the discoverability of governance is important. That leads us to one of the most contentious topics that relates to machine readable governance, and that's machine readable governance's relation to trust registries. So some people are very much of the opinion that machine readable governance should not exist, and that everything should flow from a trust registry. And I've met a few people who are of the opposite opinion, that a trust registry is a very, very bad idea. And there's a possibility that one or the other is right in every case, or in some cases. And there may also be cases where having the two work together might be a good idea. So for example, perhaps the trust registry is the way to aggregate references to the governance files. So maybe, someone says, our job is, the thing that we do as a benefit for people is we go out and collect governance files and we make them available here, and we provide some kind of rating system. And the other thing you could do is, there could be a system that where in some cases the trust registry is setting up a list of the agents or issuers that can be trusted, and you could use that to generate your governance file. Say, all right, we're going to collect the set of issuers that are in this jurisdiction from this this trust registry, and we'll publish that to the governance file. Or maybe they could help secure governance files by hosting them and saying, kind of like almost like a Better Business Bureau. Here are ones that you have been vetted and you can come look at and use. Some of the potential problems with trust registries are that at nearly every interaction where there's an issuer or a verifier or some other vetted party involved, you have to phone home to go see if they're in the trust registry, see if they're in the list. And that gives you problems where perhaps you could correlate the activities of people, and there's a single point of failure issue there where if the trust registry goes down, no one knows what to do. And a machine readable governance file may be able to mitigate some of those situations if we're interacting with the trust registry. So for example, if you originate some parts of the governance with the trust registry, but then you distribute it using a governance file, then you're not phoning home all the time, and you don't have a single point of failure. And you can cache the governance file and do things like offline interactions a lot more easily. Okay, at the end of the presentation, we have our sample files for both the governance and the presentation definition. I'll break these into separate slides so that you can actually see the bottom one. And then that's the end of the governance presentation today. We have a minute or two. Are there any last questions or comments?
I've got one.
Alrighty, go ahead.
And you touched on it some when talking about the governance framework versus trust registries. I think something that we need to explore is how do we host the governance framework in a verifiable place, if you will, like how that is coordinated. One of the things I would be very interested in exploring is if there's the possibility of actually putting it on a ledger. Because it seems like we already have, we somewhat have a place where it would make sense to place something like a governance framework to me, but so
Yeah,
maybe additional discussions needed there.
A ledger might be a really good place for a governance file or a presentation definition or an interaction document. That might be the very best place to put those, because if you don't put them there, then you have to think about, okay, how do I trust the server this is hosted on, or the contents or whatever. So yeah, that's definitely been alluded to, and it's now that we've got some working examples of governance files that actually have some utility, now it's like, okay, how do we get these out in the real world, and how do we make sure that they're trustworthy? Exactly. All right, thank you everyone for coming to today's user group meeting, and we will see you next week. I guess we'll move our playbook discussion to when Keela or Ken can work through that with us. And as far as I know, it'll be same bat time, same bat channel next week.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.